The public sector is at an inflection point as its workforce is getting older and lags behind the private sector in attracting younger employees. But before we get into the details of this situation, I'd like to take a few minutes to sketch out the context for strategically responding to it. About 10,000 baby boomers turn 65 every day, and many of them are retiring from the workforce. This wave of retirements is going to impact the public sector more than the private sector, as the public sector workforce has trended older relative to the private sector for the last 40 years. In fact, according to the Congressional Research Service, 52% of all public sector workers are 45 to 64 years old, whereas only 42% of workers in the private sector fall in that age range. Here, you can see that comparison of this cohort between the private sector and the federal, state, and local levels of the public sector. Compounding this challenge is the fact that 10% more millennials currently work in the private sector than in civil service. There is no single reason for this imbalance, but it should be mentioned that government service can be more challenging than work in other sectors. Recent research from the Partnership for Public Service shows that employee satisfaction in the public sector lags behind the private sector in terms of leadership, compensation, skill utilization, and professional development. Moreover, there are political and budgetary realities that impact government hiring. For example, during times of economic crisis or aspirations for small government, vacated staff positions may be left fallow, combined with another position, or cut from the organizational chart. While many of the factors of such staff attrition and generational transitions are beyond the control of individual government agencies, civil servants in leadership roles can do much to plan for and cultivate the future of the public sector workforce. But there's an urgency to this effort, as it may require changes in recruitment practices, benefit packages, opportunities for professional growth, and other aspects of HR policy and organizational culture. And as we all know, the evolution of government policies and practices can be slow-moving. So it's important for state arts agencies and other government agencies to start working now to prepare for the next generation of the public sector workforce, especially since the 10,000 people turning 65 today were born in 1954, which, as you can see in this chart, is the year that the baby boom kicked into high gear. But before we discuss what individual state arts agencies can do programmatically to address this challenge, let's first hear more about recent SAA staffing trends from Patricia. Patricia?
Thanks so much, Paul. So as Paul just mentioned, I'll be talking about state arts agency staffing trends. Hopefully some of you have seen NASAA's State Arts Agency Staffing Trends Report, which was published earlier this spring. This report highlights data from our staffing and compensation survey, which we administer every 2 to 3 years, to learn about SAA human resource trends and to provide what is a valuable and popular SAA resource for planning, budgeting, and recruiting. So I'll first give an overview of staffing trends from the latest staffing and compensation survey, which NASAA conducted last fall. And then for the first time, the survey also included demographic questions for SAA staff and councils. So I'll also cover certain findings from these new questions, particularly focusing on the age of state arts agency employees. So moving right along, looking at aggregate data on state arts agency staff size, this chart shows the total number of full-time agency employees over time. We did see an increase in total SAA staff between fiscal years 2016 and 2019, with a total staff size of 672 in FY 2019. However, we can also see that the total state arts agency staffing remains 7% below fiscal year 2009 levels. This positive change has not occurred for all states. 20 states are responsible for this increase in aggregate staff size over the last 3 years, with another 20 remaining flat and 12 agencies decreasing in size. The median staff size for all SAAs is 10.5, with the number of staff members ranging from 1 to 43, depending on the agency. To get a better understanding of SAA staff composition, we also broke down staff into 2 designations, program and administrative, to see if we found any differences between content areas. This chart shows the change in administrative staff size in orange and program staff size in blue since fiscal year 2009. While both have seen a decrease since 2009, we can also see that administrative staffing has taken an especially hard hit. State arts agencies have 19% fewer administrative staff than they did prior to the recession. And it is only in the last 3 years that SAAs have been able to start shoring up this gap. Now, it's been a decade since the recession. State arts agencies have adapted well to the staffing trends, which I just discussed. They've adopted a number of different tactics, programmatic staff picking up administrative slack, for instance. SAAs have also outsourced to contract or temporary personnel, developed internship programs, or borrowed time from other state agencies. These strategies can save costs, absolutely, but are unlikely to help build institutional knowledge. And speaking of institutional knowledge, as most of you know, turnover is also a challenge. This most recent survey found that the median tenure for all positions was 4 years. The median tenure by position was ranging from 3 to 5 years. And the median tenure for key positions such as executive director or deputy director has also declined in recent years. So state arts agencies, what this means is that state arts agencies are having to devote more time and money into onboarding and transition. So now going to demographics. Significantly, for the first time, this survey asked questions about demographics of state arts agency staff and council members. So now we have an important glimpse at the current diversity of the state arts agency field. Questions covered race, ethnicity, age, and other distinct demographic groups present on staff and SAA councils and boards. For the purposes of this webinar, let's focus on age. Agencies were asked to identify how many staff members are 35 years or younger or 65 years or older. About 26% of state arts agency staff are 35 years or younger. About 7% are 65 years or older. While this is on par for the public sector, individuals 35 or younger make up 35% of the broader U.S. workforce, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So that's a 10% difference between the public sector and the broader U.S. workforce when it comes to having millennials working. And there really isn't a specific cause for this discrepancy in hiring younger millennial workers. There are a few factors, though. Federal and state government recruiting and hiring decreased following the recession when many millennials were coming into the workforce. Other factors could include negative public perceptions of government, a steady increase in time to hire metrics, particularly at the federal level, lower technology capacity in government, and lack of modern recruitment practices. I would say on a positive note that data suggests millennials have a particular interest in public service and are choosing public service-oriented majors in college. The data does not support the anecdotal evidence that millennials have higher turnover rates than previous generations. So as I mentioned earlier, the pace of post-recession hiring has increased over the last 3 years for state arts agencies, and hopefully this upward trend will continue in the future. It will be crucial for the entire public sector to attract and retain younger staff members, in part to mitigate the rise in retirements, which Paul just mentioned. Even though some eligible employees may delay retirement, state and federal government will need to prepare for more than a quarter of its workforce to retire within the next decade. And I'd just like to point out that this is really an opportunity for state arts agencies not only to think about attracting young candidates, but diverse candidates that better represent the general population. Among our other demographic questions we asked, NASAA found that state arts agency personnel are definitely diverse, but do not fully mirror the demographics of the general public. Less than 25% of state arts agency staff are people of color compared to 39% of the U.S. population. This is an area for improvement that can go hand in hand when adapting measures to attract and retain a younger workforce. If you'd like to learn more about staffing trends and the results of our new demographics section of the survey, our report is available to all members. And as always, I'm just an email or call away to answer any questions or provide any additional information you may need. So with that, I will turn it back over to Paul. Thanks.
Thank you, Patricia. Now that we've heard about the state arts agency workforce, I'd like to focus on what SAAs can do programmatically to attract and train younger employees. Many state arts agencies work with volunteers and student interns. In fact, 15 SAAs report benefiting from the assistance of volunteers, and 33 have an internship program. While volunteers' opportunities are generally open to adults of all ages, they can be a good framework for recruiting younger people interested in arts management and/or public service. Internships, meanwhile, tend to be geared towards college or graduate students and include an educational or vocational component. Interns and volunteers learn from the work they undertake. According to NASAA's latest research on SAA staffing trends, interns and volunteers do more than administrative tasks. In fact, they work on research, public art maintenance, events management, and various discipline-specific projects and programs. The Connecticut Office of the Arts internship program is an example. Through it, the agency offers hand-on practical work experience to students and emerging arts professionals. Students may obtain academic credit through the program, but it is also open to professional track applicants who are not currently enrolled in an academic institution. The Clement A. Price Arts Management Intern Program of the New Jersey State Council on the Arts and Rutgers University, meanwhile, aims to provide practical and meaningful experiences working with a state arts agency. It is open to undergraduate and graduate students as well as to professionals from other fields preparing for a career change. Interns contribute to the Council's operations, grants programs, communications, and other artist services. Finally, the West Virginia Commission on the Arts has benefited from the West Virginia Governor's Internship Program, which is open to traditional and non-traditional college students studying in the state, as well as to West Virginians attending an out-of-state institution of higher learning. The program arranges internships with the Commission and with other state arts agencies, as well as with nonprofit organizations and for-profit businesses based in West Virginia. Another model for attracting and developing younger workers is the fellowship. Fellowships tend to be longer and more rigorous. Furthermore, fellowships generally focus on professional development, while internships focus on professional experience. This makes fellowships especially conducive to training future leaders of state arts agencies. It should also be noted that fellowships, more often than internships, include a paid stipend or some other salary. Examples of fellowships can be seen in Maryland and Ohio. The Maryland State Arts Council hosts 2 fellows from the Urban Arts Leadership Fellowship Program of the Greater Baltimore Cultural Alliance, which focuses on capacity building for people from historically unrepresented groups, especially people of color. One of the 2 fellowships, the Council's Arts in Education and Marketing Fellowship, is a paid opportunity to develop management and leadership skills related to grant making, teaching artist registries, and other arts education programming. The Council's Accessibility, Independent Artists, and Arts and Entertainment Fellowships, meanwhile, helps manage the Council's Individual Artist Fellowship Program, its Accessibility Program, and its statewide Cultural District Certification Program. Both fellowships are full-time positions and come with a stipend of $7,500, $5,000 of which is paid by the Maryland State Council on the Arts. The Ohio Arts Council also has 2 fellowship positions, which it presents in partnership with the Columbus Arts Marketing Association. The part-time fellowships, ranging from 12 to 24 months in length, are paid an hourly rate. Fellows are classified as independent contractors, however, and don't receive health insurance or other benefits. The Marketing and Exhibitions Fellow works with the Ohio Arts Council's RIF Gallery. The position is responsible for promoting exhibitions in the gallery, helping manage gallery openings, artist talks, and other special events, and maintaining exhibition archives. The Social Media and Special Events Fellow, meanwhile, works with the Council's Operations and Public Affairs Office on communication strategy. The position focuses especially on managing social media and event planning activities. Professional development is a key component of both of these fellowships, as each fellow gets to attend one national conference, is automatically a full member of the Columbus Arts Marketing Association, and can benefit from all of the benefits that all of the technical assistance that comes with that membership, and they undertake a capstone project. Finally, some state arts agencies create and work with a student advisory group to strengthen their arts education programming. While the primary focus of these unpaid advisory groups is not to develop future state arts agency staffers, their dynamics do expose young people to the responsibilities, challenges, and rewards of public service. In this way, they are also ways to cultivate future leaders in the public sector. The Rhode Island Teen Arts Assembly is a new group of student leaders who work with the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts and local partners on projects at the intersection of arts education, advocacy, and community engagement. The students are advisors on the Council's arts education program, and they also serve as ambassadors of the Council and speak around the state about the importance of arts learning. The Alabama State Council on the Arts, meanwhile, formed the Junior Leadership Team in 2015 to complement the Alabama Arts Education Leadership Team that it created with the Alabama Department of Education to ensure fully funded, high-quality arts education for every student in the state. The Junior Leadership Team, which had 22 college and high school students, was designed as a think tank and encouraged to focus on effective ways to communicate the needs for arts education. The Junior Leadership Team subsequently worked on a documentary film and led a social media campaign. It also contributed to the development of a new statewide arts education plan. While the Junior Leadership Team is no longer active, the Council does plan to include young people in its State Advisory Council of the Artistic Literary Consortium, which is a partnership the Council has with the Alabama State Department of Education. So these are some examples of what state arts agencies can do programmatically to support younger workers and to help bring them into the fold of state arts agencies. But let's now hear from Beth Keller and Gerald Young from the Center for State and Local Government Excellence about the recent Workforce for the Future report, and more specifically about practices related to recruitment, professional development, HR benefits, and more that are designed to really sustain and propel the future of the public sector workforce. Beth and Gerald?
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Hello?
Hi, Gerald. We've got you.
Okay, great. All right. And have you advanced the next slide yet?
Yes, we are on your Workforce of the Future Strategies to Manage Change slide.
Great. I want to apologize to those of you who might get a little bit of a delay here, but my connection is going in and out a little bit, but we are connected and sharing the slides centrally, so hopefully we'll make this as seamless as possible for you. My name is Gerald Young with the Center for State and Local Government Excellence. Next slide. I'm here with Beth Keller, who is also with the center. Beth, hello.
Hey, Gerald.
Hey. So for those of you who are not familiar with the center, on the next slide here, it gives you a little bit of background as to what the center is all about. As the name implies, we work with state and local governments, primarily in the areas of workforce, retirement, and health and wellness to help them to attract and retain talented public servants and to really dig a little bit deeper into the areas that larger trends are affecting them and their workforces. If we can go ahead 2 slides, I don't want to read any of this to you, but there is some background here on the center if you'd care to look back at it later. But the key thing I'd like to look at is what's going on with the workforce and how that might affect you. The center has been doing an annual workforce survey since 2009. We started doing that to look at what the immediate impacts were of the recession, and that was something that we did in conjunction with some partner agencies that specifically looked at state and at local human resource management decision-making. And we found most significantly for organizations that there was a huge lag in retirements. When we were looking at 2008, 2009, 2010, 11, 12, the number of agencies that were indicating that their employees were delaying their retirements, and these were people who were already retirement eligible, was about 44%. And that number stayed that high for several years and only started to drop in probably around the time of 2015 or so. 2018, it finally got back down to about 10%. So we had a number of people who were holding off on retirement, not that much happening in the way of voluntary departures from our organizations, but certainly larger numbers of layoffs, position freezes, and other moves that were intended to help to downsize the organizations. But as you look at that and what else happened in the organizations, next slide, we also saw that there was a significant rise in HR departments that were saying that they were finding certain positions as being hard to fill. And you'll notice that some of these are specific to government, like policing and firefighting, but quite a number of the positions that are hard to fill are more universal across the job market. Things like engineering or IT is one that also fits into these categories. Skilled trades, healthcare, all of them were increasing significantly post-recession, so that the organizations were saying, well, gee, we've got 2 things going on at once. The number of people who were retiring is going back up because there were fewer people postponing that. And when we are trying to recruit somebody with the low unemployment situation that is a welcome part of our economy right now, there's an awful lot of competition for those skilled employees, whatever their skill base happens to be. And government does not necessarily happen to be the first place that those people go when they are looking to find a role in an organization. And you can see on the next slide as well, again, that it's not just the, next slide, please. It's not just the police or the firefighting, it's the office positions, the accounting positions, all throughout the organization. Those positions are not only hard to fill, but in some cases they're not being filled on a full-time basis. So there are what we would call gig workers. We think of those typically as the Uber drivers, but they are also very common in state and local government at this point. The most recent survey that we just wrapped up last week is showing that as many as 20% of organizations have a significant share of employees in the gig workforce. Many of those traditionally have been, let's say, the temporary workers hired by an agency and brought in as needed for office work. But whether that's in more general roles or in the arts roles, there is a significant opportunity for organizations these days to retain somebody on a temporary or a contractual basis rather than simply filling those positions on a full-time and permanent basis. Next slide, please. So, as you're looking at filling positions, whether it's on a full-time or a gig basis, what are the methods that are going to work best? Well, as you can imagine, the traditional methods are not necessarily always the best. And looking at the top 4 categories that have come through in our surveys, it really comes down to not necessarily who you know, but the connections that you have. So those connections might be with existing employees and the referrals that they can provide, or the connections via networks of individuals that are connecting via social media, and related to those, either the online job advertisements or the government websites that allow for word to be shared, not necessarily one time, but in a sequence of sharings, so that it's really a matter of getting that word out in multiple ways that people can then take advantage of. And it's not then, again, necessarily going back to the traditional ways of doing things in order to complete that recruitment either. It's been funny looking at some of the organizations that, will perhaps reach out to somebody electronically, but when they're ready to complete that recruitment, we'll say, well, just fax us your paper resume and we'll go from there. It is a very connected means of recruiting at this point, and that seems to be where that trend is heading. Beth, would you like to talk a little bit about the demographic side of the recruitment?
Sure, thanks, Gerald. Next slide. So this gives you a little bit different look at some of the demographic changes that we talked about earlier in the webinar. As you can see, the general population in the workforce is rapidly changing. We now have a majority of millennials and Gen Z in our workforce, 56%, in fact, in 2020. And the boomers have become a smaller percentage of the workforce, and we're used to thinking of the boomer generation as being a dominant player, but now it's the millennials and Gen X, and those are going to be major factors. Next slide. We had a presentation earlier that shows you a little bit about what's going on with the demographics, and this, again, is a very simplified graphic that shows you the dominance of the baby boomers, basically those people born between 1946 and 1964. And then we had the baby bust period, and that's what we've come to think of in part as Gen X, a smaller portion of the population as fewer babies were born. And then we had the baby boom echo that has kicked in, and that has, the birth rate has remained fairly steady through this graph, 2010. Next slide. Given that we have a more youthful workforce, it's important to think about what younger workers want. And from the research we've done, we know that younger workers want quick responses. They're going to be pretty impatient if they have to wait a long time. They want continuous feedback. Perhaps older generations were a little bit more patient in their expectations around feedback, but it's not unusual for people early in their careers to want a lot of feedback. I think especially important is they want opportunities to do more. So if you hire them to do a particular job, it may not appeal to their long-term interest to do that one job, so they're going to be looking for opportunities to grow. They also want clarity about what's in it for them. What will they get if they take on additional responsibilities? They like quick rewards. Very important to them is that they can balance their work responsibilities with their personal lives. So that has driven us to make a lot of changes recently in our workforce. And finally, and this is a challenge for the public sector, they really want up-to-date technology tools. Next slide. So some of the key workforce strategies with the changes that we're seeing, it's going to be very important for leaders and organizations to embrace change management. That means in the human resources world, it's important that they see themselves as less transactional and more strategic, and helping organizations become more flexible, more creative, and more strategic, in fact. And the alliance between the top leadership and human resources has got to become a lot more important. It also means that you've got some long-standing human resources policies that may need to be revamped. For example, we've had a certain way of responding to job applications, and that just does not work in the internet age. Other private sector organizations are getting much quicker responses out to applicants than we tend to do in the public sector. And as Gerald mentioned before, we may find that we need to make some changes in our benefits package, and that will challenge us to be a little bit more flexible in how we handle things. Bottom line is, I think we've got to stay on top of the changes that are taking place, look for ways to help all workers feel like the organization is investing in them, values their opinion, and offers them meaningful ways to learn and grow. Next slide. Some of the trends and innovations that we've seen in our research have to do with being a little bit more of an outreach organization. We can become a little bit insular no matter how large or small our organization might be. And sometimes we not only need to seek feedback from employees, but we may need to seek feedback from our customers, the people who come to enjoy what we offer, as well as if we have commissions of elected officials, making sure we get feedback from them. We may have some business processes that haven't been examined for a long time, and if we took a look at them, we might find ways to create some efficiencies and modernize our operations. And then finally, I think the issue of engaging our employees, whether that's through surveys of our employees, training efforts, or supporting organized group activities that may be of interest, those are the kinds of things that are going to be really important for future success. And lastly, and I'm going to say this more than once, follow up. When we hear from our employees that something is important to them and we're able to accommodate it, we need to follow up. Next slide. I'm going to talk about some recruitment strategies, bearing in mind that some of these examples may not be precisely what will work in your particular organization, but they may give you ideas for how you could adapt them for your own agency. If you're not finding the pool of candidates that you would like for a particular job that you need to fill, one thing that has been tried with a good bit of success is to grow your own pool of candidates. That's been done in a number of places. One that we looked at in our recent report was in Minneapolis, where they weren't getting as many police officer candidates as they needed who were qualified, so they created a pathway to allow people who might never have thought about a law enforcement career to experience what it's like through being a community service officer. And then they could become qualified to actually apply to become a police officer. Another strategy that has proven quite successful, and again, this goes to paying attention to what is important to employees. San Antonio, knowing it can't compete on salary, has become very creative on the benefit side. They have a parental leave policy that all employees from the date of hire qualify for 6 weeks of parental leave, and that's for time upon birth, adoption, or even a placement of a child from the foster care system. In addition to that, they enhanced their paid time off policy that not only provides 24 additional hours of leave that may be used for specific purposes, such as approval to volunteer at a nonprofit, to get an annual physical, perhaps to attend a parent-teacher conference, or even adopt a pet from the city's animal shelter. I think this points up the importance that benefits have in the public sector. You may not feel like your benefits are as good as you'd like them to be, but compared to the private sector, we find that most government agencies have better benefits, and it's important to make sure your prospective employees understand the benefits package. Next slide. We have some pretty creative ways that many of our governmental organizations are finding talent. I was very impressed that the City and County of San Francisco has a really tough job market, very competitive there, and they realize they have excellent candidates among the disabled population, and they can get some assistance from the state government in getting support to make sure they can provide the accommodations that are required. The city also has a fellows program that provides outreach to historic Black colleges, and that has been another pipeline to bring in talent into the organization. Different uses of social media and the internet are being tried, such as San Antonio having a virtual job fair with the National Forum for Black Public Administrators. And then here was one that I thought was quite interesting. The state of Michigan not only uses infographics, photos, and posters to try to be more appealing because younger workers are much more visual, they also had a staff poster contest. And they put up winning posters around the workplace. And the first year that they did this, there was a little skepticism among employees. But the second year, there was less skepticism and more great posters. Next slide. So once you get people into your organization, as I could see from your data, one of the big challenges is retention. And that is, I think, becoming an even greater challenge with a younger workforce, which tends to be more mobile anyway. But there's just more competition out there. And as you see it, I think one of your areas of competition is in the finance sector. It's just a very challenging period to be able to hold on to talent. So one of the things that can be done in many organizations is to encourage professional development of your current staff, and even to encourage networking. Denver, for instance, sees it as a big advantage that their, for instance, human resources staff have speaking opportunities, get out to professional events in the city or even in the nation to network with others and be stimulated by that. Leadership development has been, I think, probably one of the most important areas of focus. We have several examples in a recent report about how there was indication from staff that they really wanted leadership development, and so the governments followed up in the state of Michigan, in the city of Centennial, Colorado, and in Johnson County, Kansas. We have an example that I think is interesting. If you're a relatively small organization, how do you network? How do you connect up with others and give them opportunities? The city of Sunnyvale is not a small city. It's over 100,000. But nonetheless, in the specialty areas, they don't always have enough people within the city to network with. So they've set up a regional talent exchange program within the broader Santa Clara County area with multiple local governments, giving their staff the opportunity to work in another organization in the Bay Area. Next slide. So we've talked about employee engagement a little bit, and how do we do compared to the private sector? Unfortunately, we are not doing nearly as well as the private sector in engaging our employees. And I think this presents us with an opportunity. There's no reason we can't do more employee engagement. It isn't costly. It's mostly a matter of political will. And one thing we know about employee engagement is when people feel connected to their organization and its mission, they're more highly motivated and the results are also better. I think that the key here is to make sure that if you do ask employees what's important to them, that you follow up on it. Next slide. So we have a classic effort that involves typically an online survey where employees are asked to describe areas of the greatest importance to them and what they would like to learn. State of Michigan, when they understood that employees wanted leadership development, they set up a program that has really attracted a large number of their staff to go through the process. Johnson County, Kansas implemented a supervisory training program as a result of employee survey data. And this is just a good reminder that many people don't leave their jobs, they leave their bosses. So if we can help supervisors become more effective, that's very important. Sometimes the things that are important to employees that come up through a survey or in informal conversations with employees can surprise you. In addition to things like leadership development, City of Sunnyvale, not surprisingly, found that employees wanted alternative work schedules, big issue in a highly congested area. But they also wanted better access to good coffee. The city had cut out coffee when they had the recession, and so that was something that became important to employees. They found a way to get a coffee cart set up by the library that was done in cooperation with a nonprofit and gave homeless folks learning experiences in providing high-quality coffee right on the workplace. Next slide. In addition to the surveys that I mentioned, it's also very effective to make sure you provide face-to-face opportunities for employees to interact with leadership. Minneapolis has a number of employee groups. There's a women's group, there's an African-American group, there's a group of military employees. And some of these came about when the employees listened to their elected officials say they had diversity goals for the city. And so the employees thought, well, you know, you should talk to us. We're the ones that are in the city. We can tell you how to make progress in this area. They also have internal staff career development fairs. So it's not just job fairs for prospective candidates, but also to help people look at ways they could grow. And again, for a smaller agency, this might be something that could be done with a couple of organizations to make it more meaningful. San Antonio has a women's leadership program that offers not only one-on-one conversations among younger workers or newer workers with more experienced leaders, but it also allows people to establish mentor relationships with others. In the case of San Antonio, they even have sort of a speed dating approach to mentoring so that you can try out in a pretty quick and efficient way whether you feel like this might be a good person that you'd like to learn from. And then finally, always remembering the value of recognition. There is precious little recognition in the public sector, and State of Michigan has a program they call COIN, which recognizes employees who exemplify the values of the organization, and they get a coin, an actual coin that shows what they are being recognized for. Next. Next slide. I mentioned earlier that streamlining processes is another area that adds a lot of value. We can become fairly bureaucratic in organizations and go on autopilot. And there are often some technology tools that are available. We have one example in a recent report that looks at online candidate screening as something that could be improved through automation. But there are other kinds of steps that you can take to improve your processes that might be more appropriate for your own organization. Next slide. I think our big advantage in government is what we do and why we do it. So a lot of government organizations have started to think about how they convey the value of what they do, and they've come up even with messaging that I think is working out to be quite successful. Such messages as you can serve your community and build careers, that's Minneapolis. Be part of the city you love is a Denver theme. And what they have done in Denver is they have brand champions, photographs of employees doing work that they love, and these billboards appear around the city and the posters appear on public transit. And since they've done this campaign, their applications for jobs are up 10%. So I think all of these issues emphasize that government is a place where you can make a difference. And we have a lot of pretty inexpensive tools on technology to showcase our staff on social media. Johnson County does YouTube videos and posts these videos of some of their staff in positions that may never occur to people that exist and might be fun to work for. Next slide. So before I turn it back to Gerald, just another way of emphasizing the bottom line of our big advantage in the public sector is that we're really committed to the public good. But we are in a competitive world, so I want Gerald to give you a little bit more about the competition we're facing now.
All right, thank you, Beth. Yes, next slide, please. So we look at what's going on in government hiring, and in some ways we are in a good place right now. As I mentioned earlier, unemployment is low, and from the projections that we've seen, there will continue to be growth in employment both in the state and local government sectors, roughly 4 to 7% growth. That is not just bringing us back up to where we were. If you look at this next slide, it shows you a little bit of the trough that we hit with the recession. This is looking at a couple of different factors. I think the most dramatic of them is the top one, which represents job openings. The same type of pattern can be seen in overall employment, that basically it was until about 2016 before we got back up to where we had been pre-recession. But the growth that we're seeing since then, the 3.6%, 3.8% that's projected for state employment growth in the next number of years, is all on top of what we've been able to eke back out, getting back to that status quo pre-recession. But it's not just a static 3.8% across the board. If we look at the next slide, we can see that there's significant variation in where that employment growth is going to take place. So on this next slide that's coming up, we see a bar chart that talks about managers, as an example, are only anticipated to grow by 2.5% in 2016 to 2026, significantly below the 3.8% overall, with supervisors going down by 3.3%. So it's really a question, as you look at the folks you have within the organization or the types of positions you have within the organization, does that happen to be on the management side or the supervisory side? Even as we look at some of the chief executives within organizations, some of those positions are actually projected to decline in the next few years, not necessarily because of technology alone. I think that's one of the big things that we're looking at on the clerical side that's projected to go down by a whopping 12%, but in greater efficiencies that are being achieved via some of the tools and resources that are made available to us these days, that perhaps the span of control of a single manager can be a little bit wider, or in some cases that consolidations may take place between organizations that, again, might not have been even thought possible in the past. So, as you're looking at what your organizational needs are, be aware that some of those may be changing. And as you see on the next slide, that share of any particular portion of the overall employment picture will change as well. And if you look at I think the most significant one for all of us on the phone today, it's the second to the right bar that represents administration, which is going to be projected to decline from about 18% to about 16%. So a fairly significant drop as a share of overall employment, whereas some of the other fields that are projected to increase, may not directly impact an arts agency in the fact that you might not have your own healthcare or judicial employees on board. But some of the other areas like finance as well, information technology, are expected to at least stay steady or increase over the next few years. As we look at competition, the last of the statistics that I will share with you on the next slide is that, yes, benefits are a significant portion of compensation for public employees, but they're also a significant source of competitiveness for public organizations. As you look at surveys that we've done on whether organizations feel that their wages are competitive with the private sector, maybe it's only half or so that will say that yes, they feel that they're in some way competitive with the private sector, but a significant portion feel that their benefits are competitive. Most of the organizations are already providing the basics that even some of the private sector employees are providing, the sick leave, the paid jury duty or paid holidays. I think one of the areas that remains for potential growth is paid family leave. That's definitely been a hot button topic over the last few years. But still, even though it's 22 to 26% of state and local governments that are providing those benefits, it's maybe 13% or so of private sector that are even considering that type of thing. So as you're looking at what's going to help you to retain employees, in some cases it might be those paid benefits, or as Beth alluded to as well, maybe it's some of the softer touch benefits in terms of the additional flexibility that you might be able to provide for your employees, or the ability for them to grow in their career track without having to leave the organization. So just to wrap up then, next slide, please. Beth?
So, yeah, we'll go over these just really quickly because we want to have a little bit of time for questions. One of the things we hadn't talked about before is effective onboarding, and by that what we mean is making sure you bring people into your organization thoughtfully. And then once you have them on board, you may want to think about conducting periodic stay interviews to find out what's going well, what the manager can do to help a new employee overcome challenges. Next slide. And I think just to remind you that you have real opportunities to create the kind of workforce you need for the future, and focus on your brand, making sure that you give a lot of attention to being a learning organization, and you take a look at some of those old policies that may need to be revamped. Let's pause there. I'll turn it back to our organizer to see if we have some questions.
Great. Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Gerald. Those were some great data, and I really appreciate you digging down deep into your research. So I'd like to get into some questions. We just have a few minutes left, and I'd like to ask a few, so we might go a little quickly because we have a fair number of them. I'm going to start off by asking a question which combines several different questions, and that's about attracting candidates. Government service has a negative stereotype, it can, and there is a perception of low morale among public sector workers. So I'm curious, what is the top selling point for job candidates seeking government positions? What's the pitch to bring in prospective employees? And related to that, how do you enthuse current employees and help them look past the negative stereotypes that can be projected onto them?
So I'll take a crack at that. I think our number one selling point, and that's for new employees as well as why we stay in organizations that may not pay as well as other jobs, that's a sense of purpose. People are looking for meaning. They want to be able to do something that makes a difference to society. I think on the tangible side, we do have an edge on benefits very often. I think where we have an opportunity to do more is on the work-life balance and the career development. And I think some of our organizations get a little bit casual about that, and that's an area of great potential. Gerald, do you want to add anything?
Yes, I think that the image of government is often of a very bureaucratic civil service system that's slow-moving and not very flexible. And in some ways that can be the case, but even though on an appropriations side it can be a little bit more hidebound, I think there is significant flexibility to adapt on some of the more, let's say the flexible work schedules and hours and conditions that might be made available to employees, the cross-training that might be made available to expose them to opportunities in other departments, to expose them to mentors who might help them in their career. There are so many ranges of talent within an organization that, whether that's internal to a particular agency or in the example that Beth shared about Sunnyvale earlier, in the network of government agencies, that I think, it's not just a matter of staying within your own little formalized cubbyhole within the organization. You have the ability to grow far beyond that, and I think governments have recognized the fact that without changing their civil service systems, they can adapt and be agile just like any other organization.
Interesting. Great. Thank you for that. And I think we have time for just one more question. This is looking at the situation from a different angle, and that's state arts agencies, like other public agencies, often feel pressure from legislators, from governors, to reduce the size of their agency, to trim the fat, so to speak. So there's a perennial question about how to best make the case for the importance of personnel, of staff, of human resources. How do you justify investing in people, not just services? What do you think?
I always say without people, we're not going to have good services. So you obviously want to have the right people. And I think investing in people is a win-win. I think legislatures understand that they want to have top quality people, even if they think they want fewer. So investing in convincing our elected leaders to provide support for professional development and growth. And I think we have to do a better job of selling that. We're too quick to cut that professional development budget when times are tight.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I would add that I think, there's a strategic angle first. If there is a strategic goal that you're trying to achieve, certainly it makes sense to articulate that goal first. But you will probably find that you're not going to achieve that goal as quickly if you do not staff up to support that. And it may be in the short term, let's say your goal is to put up a new website for the agency. Great, maybe you can start that process going via the gig economy or a contractor or what have you. But if you want a much more robust and interactive and up-to-date site, that fully engages the community, you're probably going to find before too long that in order to move the needle on the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, that you're going to have at least a dedicated number of staff for each of those functions that you're trying to carry out.
The last thing I would say about that is just make sure that you share what you're doing and do it rather publicly. Put it on your website, the progress you're making, and just, repeat messages. It takes at least 7 times before people get a message. And not to make a joke, but perhaps with elected officials it might be 8 or 9, I'm not sure. But repeat your message, show your progress, document your results.
Okay.
And I would add to that, document your results even if they're not favorable. because the perception of government is also that they're trying to hide information from the public. Be upfront about the results if they're not all that you expected, and maybe in some ways that's helping you to make the case that you need the staffing in order to help move those projects forward.
Okay, that's some good advice. Transparency, and make sure that the public officials know what we and state arts agencies are doing. We're so busy working that sometimes it can be difficult to remember that we have to make sure people are aware of all we're doing. So that's a good point. Yes, perhaps elected officials do need to hear a little more than 7 times. So that's a good thought. Well, unfortunately, that brings us to a little past 4 o'clock and the end of our time together. So Beth and Gerald, I want to thank you again for sharing all of your research, really digging into the details for us. Also, Patricia, I want to thank you for going over NASAA's latest staffing trends report. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in today and listening and sending in some questions. We appreciate that, and I hope you have a good rest of the week and a good weekend. Thank you, and take care. Bye-bye.